I was standing at the kitchen counter rinsing a coffee mug when my brother said it like he was reading a calendar. "You've got a week to clear out." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He was sitting at our grandmother's old dining table, turning his fork slowly between his fingers, like this was already settled. My parents stayed quiet. My mom kept looking down at her plate, smoothing her napkin over and over. My dad chewed once, swallowed, and kept his eyes on the roast like it had suddenly become interesting. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask him to repeat it. I just nodded, reached down beside my chair, and felt the edge of a manila envelope in my tote bag. The paper inside was stiff, official. It had been sitting there all afternoon, waiting. I set my mug in the drying rack, wiped my hands on a towel, and went back to the table. No one noticed the envelope yet. Not then. And that was the strange part. How calm it all felt, right before everything shifted. My name is Hannah Mercer. I'm 29, and I grew up in a town called Briar Glen, Massachusetts, the kind of place with one blinking traffic light and a historic society that takes itself very seriously. Our family house wasn't just a house. It was a tall, weathered Victorian with a wraparound porch, creaky floorboards that announced you no matter how careful you tried to be, and stained glass panels in the front door that cast little colored shapes across the entryway in the late afternoon. It had belonged to my grandmother Rose for as long as I could remember. Before that, it belonged to her mother. That house had a way of making you feel like you were living inside a long story you didn't get to edit. Growing up, my brother Caleb was the center of everything. If he spoke, my parents listened. If he wanted something, there was always a way to make it happen. I learned early that my role was to be fine, low maintenance, independent, the kid who didn't need much. So I found my quiet places where I could. The library, my sketchbooks, the back porch steps beside my grandmother when she'd sit with a cardigan over her shoulders and a glass of iced tea sweating onto a coaster. She was the only one in the family who would look at me like I was real. When I left for college, I didn't make a big announcement. I just packed, hugged her longer than anyone else, and drove out of town the morning after graduation. I studied design and restoration, the practical kind of work, the kind you can measure with plans and permits and inspections. After school, I moved to Philadelphia and built a life that was mine. I worked at a firm that specialized in adaptive reuse projects, old buildings turned into functional spaces without stripping them of what made them matter. The farther away I got, the quieter my relationship with my parents became. Phone calls turned into short updates, holidays became complicated, and Caleb stayed in Briar Glen, working with my dad and showing up every Sunday like a loyal habit. Whenever I called home, my mom always found a way to say it. "Caleb's been such a help. Caleb fixed the gutters. Caleb handled the bank stuff for us." She never said, "We miss you." My grandmother did, though. She would leave voicemails that were more like little check-ins. "Just calling to hear your voice, sweetheart. I made that apple cake you like. I froze some. And Hannah, listen, don't say everything out loud in this house." That last line always stayed with me, not because it sounded dramatic. It didn't. It sounded practical, like advice you give when you've watched people for a long time. I hadn't been back in almost 3 years when my dad called. He didn't ease into it. "Your grandmother passed in her sleep last night," he said. "Funeral's Saturday." Just facts. No pause. No softness. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a minute with my phone in my lap, watching people cross the street like nothing had happened. I remember thinking how weird it was that the world stayed normal when something important ended. 20 minutes later, I got another call. Mrs. Daly, my grandmother's home nurse. Her voice was gentle, careful. "Hannah," she said, "I wasn't sure if your parents told you, but she kept asking for you, and she wanted you to check her writing desk, the small drawer, the one she always kept locked." I told her thank you. I said I'd be there. Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slow. Because I already knew Caleb would be in that house, moving through it like it belonged to him, and because I had a feeling that whatever was in that drawer was going to matter. By the time I drove into Briar Glen 2 days later, the sky was low and gray, and the porch light was on, even though it was still afternoon. Caleb's SUV was parked in the spot my grandmother always used. I parked behind him, cut the engine, and listened for a second. Just the ticking of the cooling car, the faint wind against bare branches. Then I picked up my bag, felt the weight of it, and walked up the front steps like I was entering a place that had already decided what it thought of me. The front door opened before I knocked. My mother stood there, already dressed like company might arrive at any moment. Her hair was set, her sweater pressed. "Hannah," she said, stepping forward for a quick hug that didn't quite land. "You're in the guest room, the one upstairs." "Not my old room." I didn't comment. I just nodded and stepped inside. The house smelled like furniture polish and something reheated, familiar but altered, like someone had tried to preserve a memory without understanding it. My dad was in the living room, sitting in his usual chair with the newspaper folded neatly on his lap. "Drive okay?" he asked, eyes still on the page. "Fine," I said. That was it. "No, I'm glad you're here." No mention of my grandmother. Caleb arrived later with his wife and kids, filling the house with noise that felt performative. He hugged me with one arm, loose and quick. "Didn't think you'd actually make it," he said quietly, like a joke meant only for himself. Dinner that night felt like a meeting no one admitted was happening. Decisions were already made, flowers ordered, guest lists finalized. Every question I asked had already been answered by Caleb. "We've got it handled," he kept saying. "No need to worry." I noticed the way my parents deferred without realizing they were doing it, how my mom looked to him before answering, how my dad nodded along, even when he didn't seem convinced. After dinner, I wandered down the hallway toward my grandmother's room. The door was open. Her space had been stripped, not empty, but curated. The quilt she always folded at the foot of the bed was gone. Her jewelry box wasn't on the dresser. The walls were bare where photos had been. "Looking for something?" Caleb said from behind me. "Just noticing," I replied. "We packed up the important stuff already," he said. "Didn't want anything getting misplaced." I turned to the small writing desk in the corner. It was still there, untouched. "That desk stays," he added quickly. "Mom said to leave it for now." Later that night, when the house finally went quiet, I went back. I closed the door softly and sat at the desk, running my hand along the edge where the wood had been worn smooth over decades. The drawer was locked, just like Mrs. Daly said it would be, but the bottom panel shifted when I pressed gently. Inside was an envelope with my name written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, and a small metal key taped to the inside. I didn't open it right away. I just held it for a moment, listening to the house settle around me. The next morning, conversation stopped when I walked into the kitchen. My mom busied herself with toast. Caleb checked his phone. "Funeral details," he said quickly when I asked what they were talking about. Later, I overheard him on the phone in my dad's study. The door wasn't fully closed. "Yes, after Saturday," he said. "It's solid, no complications." I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. That afternoon, I drove to the local bank. The clerk recognized my grandmother's name immediately. "She was very organized," she said, sliding the box across the counter. Inside were copies of deeds, legal filings, and a letter explaining decisions my grandmother had made years ago, quietly, deliberately. I made copies, returned everything exactly where it was. By the time I drove back to the house, the weight of the envelope in my bag felt different. Not heavier, clearer. That night, we sat down for what my mother called a proper family dinner. The table was set with my grandmother's china, candles lit, formal, intentional. Caleb took the head of the table. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and cleared his throat. "So," he said, calm and practiced, "we need to talk about next steps." No one looked surprised. I waited, and when he finally told me I had 1 week to leave, I didn't interrupt him. I didn't argue. I just reached for my bag. Then I waited. I didn't pull the envelope out right away. Caleb was still talking, laying out his plan in that steady, reasonable tone he used when he wanted something to sound final. Bigger place for his family, my parents downsizing, everyone doing what made sense. I listened. I always had. When he finished, he looked at me like he expected resistance, maybe tears, maybe an argument he could win. Instead, I slid the envelope onto the table. It made a soft sound against the wood. Not dramatic. Just enough. "What's that?" he asked. "Property records," I said. "And the will, the filed one." My mom's hand froze around her glass. My dad finally looked up. Caleb gave a short laugh. "You're confused. I already went over all that with Mom and Dad." I opened the envelope and placed the first document between the salt and pepper shakers, then the second, then the third. I didn't explain them. I didn't have to. The room got very quiet. My dad leaned forward reading. His mouth tightened in a way I recognized, how he looked at contracts he didn't like but couldn't dismiss. This says... He stopped, started again. This says the house was transferred 3 years ago. My mom whispered my grandmother's name like it might change something. Caleb shook his head slowly. That's not possible. It is, I said. He reached for the papers, scanning faster now. His jaw set. You were out of town, he said. She wasn't well. This could be challenged. She had a cognitive evaluation the same week, I replied, sliding another page forward. It's attached. No one spoke. I hadn't raised my voice once. Caleb stood abruptly, chair legs scraping the floor. This is manipulation. She wouldn't do this without telling us. She told me, I said. That landed harder than anything else. My mom started crying quietly, not loudly, just enough to be heard. Caleb looked at my parents, waiting for backup. It didn't come. My dad exhaled slowly. This looks legitimate. Caleb's face flushed. So you're just going to accept this? I'm saying it's real, my dad answered. That's different. I gathered the documents back into the envelope, keeping my movements slow, controlled. Given tonight, I said, I think it's best if we reset expectations. Caleb stared at me. You don't get to dictate anything. I do, I said calmly, as of 3 years ago. Silence again, heavy, uncomfortable. I stood, picked up my bag. You have 24 hours, I added. We'll sort details later. Jessica finally spoke, her voice small. 24? I nodded once. Then I walked out of the dining room, leaving the table exactly as it was. Upstairs, I closed the guest room door and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. That was when I heard the front door open again, and voices. Caleb wasn't done. Neither, apparently, was my grandmother. I didn't go back downstairs right away. I sat on the bed and listened to the house instead. The low murmur of voices drifting up through the vents, the familiar creak of the front steps as someone paced, the way tension changes the sound of a room. When I finally stood, I didn't feel rushed. I felt organized. I had already made a decision earlier that day at the bank, even if I hadn't fully named it yet. Once the documents were confirmed, I'd shifted out of emotion and into process. That's how I handle things, step by step. Step 1, verify ownership, done. Step 2, secure neutral confirmation, already in motion. Step 3, say less than necessary and let facts do the work. I went downstairs just as the doorbell rang. Caleb had brought a lawyer, a thin man in a dark suit who introduced himself politely, like this was all routine. There are concerns about the timing of the transfer, he began. There aren't, I said. But you're welcome to review the filings. Caleb tried to move past me into the living room. My dad stepped in first. This is Hannah's house, he said quietly, according to the records. That stopped everyone. The lawyer hesitated. Perhaps we should all sit. Before anyone could agree, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Mrs. Daly, my grandmother's nurse, standing beside Mr. Levin, the family attorney who'd handled our legal matters for decades. She told me this might be today, Mrs. Daly said gently. Said the timing would be right. Mr. Levin nodded once. There's a video statement to be played. It was recorded and notarized. Caleb scoffed, but there was a flicker in his eyes now, uncertainty. The laptop was set up on the coffee table. My grandmother appeared on the screen, seated in her library chair, composed and unmistakably herself. She spoke clearly, calmly, naming decisions, naming patterns, naming reasons. She didn't sound angry. She sounded resolved. When the video ended, no one spoke. Mr. Levin closed the laptop. There's also a trust established for taxes and maintenance. Caleb's lawyer quietly packed his briefcase. Caleb didn't say anything at all. He just left. Later that night, after the house finally went quiet again, my parents stood in the foyer with their coats on. We'll stay somewhere else for a bit, my dad said. Figure things out. I nodded. That's probably best. After they left, I locked the door, turned off the lights one by one, and sat alone in the living room. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. And for the first time since arriving, The house felt like it was breathing normally again. The next morning, the house was quiet in a way that felt intentional. No rushed footsteps, no doors opening and closing, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the old clock in the hallway. I was at the kitchen table with a mug of tea when the doorbell rang. I already knew who it was. Caleb stood on the porch alone this time. No lawyer, no audience. His shoulders were squared, but his face looked tight, like he hadn't slept. "I need to talk to you," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. We didn't sit at the dining table. That felt deliberate. Instead, we stood in the living room near the window that overlooked the front garden. My grandmother's roses were still bare, just beginning to show small green buds. Caleb spoke first. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I've talked to another attorney. There's nothing to contest." I nodded once. I didn't say anything. "But this," he gestured vaguely around him, "this doesn't make sense. You don't even live here." "Not yet," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. "So what's the plan? You move in alone? Turn it into some kind of shrine?" I shook my head. No. That seemed to surprise him more than anything else so far. "I'm converting part of the house," I continued. "East wing only. Community use, studio space, classes, preservation work." He stared at me. "That's it?" "That's enough," I said. "And how does that pay for all this?" he asked, the old edge creeping back in. "Taxes, maintenance. This place eats money." "There's a trust," I said. "And I'm not quitting my work. I've already arranged consulting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You really thought this through?" "Yes." He exhaled sharply like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the angle. I offered a compromise. "I know. And you're saying no." "I am." Not because I didn't hear him, not because I didn't understand him, but because this was the boundary. He nodded slowly. "Then I guess that's it." "I guess it is." He walked toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "she named my daughter after herself." I let that sit. "She should know the house," I replied. "She's welcome here." That made him pause, just for a second. Then he left. I locked the door behind him and stood there, listening to his car fade down the street. There was no relief rush, no satisfaction, just quiet. I went back to the kitchen, rinsed my mug, and placed it carefully in the drying rack. Then I waited. The confirmation came the next day, not with drama, but with paperwork. An email from Mr. Levin, attached PDFs, filed dates, recorded transfers, the trust documentation my grandmother had set up quietly, methodically, years earlier. Everything aligned, no loopholes, no leverage left. By the end of the week, my parents had settled into a short-term rental nearby. We spoke in brief, careful check-ins, neutral ground, clear boundaries. Caleb didn't call again. I spent the next few days doing ordinary things in an extraordinary place. I sorted through drawers that hadn't been opened in years, labeled folders, stacked books, made lists. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, learning the rhythms of the space without anyone watching. In the afternoons, I walked through the rooms with a notebook, marking what stayed, what needed repair, what could adapt without erasing history. There was no rush. The house had waited longer than any of us. On Friday, Mrs. Daly stopped by with a small box wrapped in brown paper. "She wanted you to have this later," she said, "after things settled." Inside were my grandmother's old sketches, building studies, handwritten notes in the margins, careful, thoughtful work. "She studied design," Mrs. Daly added. "Never finished. Life got in the way." That made sense. A quiet continuity I hadn't noticed before. That night, I emailed my firm and formally transitioned to consulting. Fewer projects, more control, enough stability to build something here. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No last confrontation, no apology speech, just acceptance, delivered in stages. By Sunday morning, I was alone in the house. I opened the windows, let air move through rooms that had held tension for years. I made coffee, sat at the table, reviewed my notes. Ownership didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility, clearly defined and manageable. 3 months later, the house felt different, not quieter, more settled. Most mornings, I started the day the same way. Windows open, coffee brewing, a slow walk through the east wing to check that nothing had shifted overnight. Old houses move a little. You learn to listen. The first workshop space opened in what used to be the formal parlor. Local artists, small groups, nothing flashy, just steady use, respectful of the building. My parents moved back into the west side in a way that worked for all of us. Separate entrance, clear boundaries, simple routines. Caleb came by once, quietly, with his daughter. He didn't stay long. He didn't argue. He just walked through the rooms and nodded like he was recalibrating something internal. That was enough. In the evenings, when the house was empty again, I'd sit in my grandmother's chair with a cup of tea and go through her notes. Not instructions, observations, small decisions recorded over time, proof that calm, patient choices add up. One afternoon, a woman from the next town over stopped by after a class. She told me about a similar situation in her family, an old property, pressure, silence that had gone on too long. I gave her a name, a number, a starting point. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one house. It was about knowing when to stop negotiating with people who only listen to leverage, and learning how to build that leverage quietly, legally, and without raising your voice. That evening, I locked up, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the entryway, listening to the house settle into night. Everything was where it belonged. If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to be part of this community. Please like the video and subscribe. It helps more people find these stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read everyone. 2 more popular stories are coming up next. One about a family business dispute and another about a will no one expected. Thank you for listening.